This presentation is the culmination of the past 4 years, of which 3 years were dedicated to a study of physical, mental, and spiritual health. And this is the first time I have presented these findings before a formal audience. And the study data collection was concluded in January. So this is hot off the press. Before I get into the details of the study, I'd like to give you a little bit more background, because to understand the research landscape that we are trying to navigate in this particular area of faith and health, it's useful to understand some of the complexity and why this study could serve as a useful prototype that others might want to replicate and certainly improve upon. There are approximately 15,000 existing publications on faith, religiosity, and health over the past 30 years. And they have shown undeniably that faith and religion is the backbone of society, and that there are definite health advantages associated with an active faith life. We find that our orientation, our spiritual orientation to life, defines the healthcare resources we use, whether or not we adhere or comply with healthcare advice, the type of treatments we choose, whether or not patients are satisfied, whether or not the treatment is effective. And of course, in chronic or in so-called incurable conditions, faith and an eternal perspective is an essential component of the experience of the afflicted. Now, what is also evident from science is that positive religious coping is supportive of recovery, and that there are indeed affirmed positive health outcomes and improved quality of life when people have a positive religious coping mechanism. But the converse is also true. When people believe God has abandoned them, God is punishing them, the devil is doing this to them, and God is powerless to help them, God doesn't love them anymore, when those negative religious coping aspects are part of the person's perspective on their illness, it has adverse outcomes. So with that introduction, let me now look at this particular avenue of research, because I hope it will intrigue you. And this brings me to a ministry called Be in Health. Now, Be in Health is a not-for-profit organization associated with Pleasant Valley Church in Thomaston, Georgia, United States. And the center, the heartbeat of the program, is a 40-hour, intensive, biblically based training program with teaching, ministry, and discipleship, together with prayer, to address issues of spiritual, psychological, and mental health. The team has had about 25 years' experience focusing on this area, and specifically on so-called spiritual roots of disease, such as bitterness, fear of abandonment, and the like, the various relational barriers to love, and the effects of fear, guilt, and shame. In other words, our bad response to the pain of life on our health. They focus very heavily on the issues of forgiveness, understanding how to separate people from their sin, love the person, hate the sin, and of course being reconciled to God the Father by also being reconciled to their earthly father. In this approach, what they have seen is especially breakthroughs in the physical in particular areas: chronic mental health conditions, severe allergies and food sensitivities, incurable autoimmune diseases, endocrine diseases, malignancies, and cardiovascular disorders, particularly conduction disturbances. The ministry has been expanded to the Netherlands, Israel, South Africa, and the Philippines, and similar experiences have been had throughout the world. Nevertheless, there was not a systematic review of the outcomes, and I felt that this was necessary. Now, the ministry in Thomaston has an ample setting. The auditorium is maybe twice the size of this room. They've got a good information technology system, online registration, a very professional group of staff. So I was comfortable to serve as a remote primary investigator for the study. They've had approximately 60,000 people through the program, and the program is run every third week, and there are about 30 to 50 people going through the program. So it was relatively easy to foresee that we'd have enough individuals. So much for the material component. I have zero background in the social sciences, let alone in religion or faith and health. But fortuitously, during a time that I was involved with a diving organization and worked in America, I did a fellowship at Duke University as well. I was able to attend a research workshop by Professor Harold Koenig. And if there's someone I would really encourage this network to invite to speak to us, it would be Professor Harold Koenig. He presents 2 research workshops, usually in June and August every year, in which over a week he trains you how to conduct research in the area of faith and health, and shows you the tools, shows you the pitfalls, and he's done so for many, many years and is a prolific author. Through his mentorship, I came up with a study design. I called the study PhyMeSH, Physical, Mental and Spiritual Health. I did not want to specifically associate it with a program, such as Be in Health or For My Life, because I hoped that this would be a generic prototype that could be applied to other settings, other ministry contexts, and be expanded. Kenneth Pargament was a colleague who added to the scale and introduced the 7 components on negative religious coping. Okay, so here we go. The study was titled Effect of Faith-Based Education Seminar on Self-Assessed Physical, Mental and Spiritual Health. Now, when people hear self-assessed, they immediately think it's subjective. And of course, mental health in many respects is. But all the scales we chose are validated. In other words, these tests have undergone rigorous testing, that they were reliable and reproducible and relevant, so that they were applicable to the condition, that if you did a retest assessment, that you would get the same results, and that they were specifically associated with the condition in question. The study period was 3 years, enrollment was 21 months, and as I say, everybody went to Be in Health in Thomaston, and our institutional review board approved the observational study. Now, apart from myself, Professor Rusty Turner is a pediatric neurologist with a specialty in biostatistics from the Medical University of South Carolina, was a co-investigator. Lavenda Summers was the research coordinator that did the lion's share of the work. Jim Faulkner on IT, Jack Mankey is my colleague at Stellenbosch, also on biostatistics, and Charles van Wyk is a clinical psychologist. Okay, so here's how the sample was derived. We started out with 2,650 people, of which 1,995 were ineligible because they'd gone to the program before, they'd read the book before they came, they'd attended a conference before. In other words, they weren't truly unexposed individuals. And we wanted to see what would be the effect on someone who had never heard the message before. So that was then reduced to 655. Those were invited automatically and electronically. 139 said no thank you. 242 had problems with the mouse and the computer. So in the end, 274 finished the first survey. Out of those, 26 never attended the program. So they enrolled, they intended to come, they did the first survey, but they actually never went through the program. So they were controls. And 248 actually physically came to the program. But out of those, when we did an on-site interview, another 37 were ineligible. So we wanted to be very rigorous. We eliminated people who were underage, were not primarily English-speaking, had not completed the surveys themselves, or had been exposed to the material at any point prior to starting the actual program. So that gave us 211 cases. Our projection was that we only needed 40 to achieve clinical significance. So we were very happy with 211. Now, all of these individuals had to complete a 91-item questionnaire. This is just the flow chart. I won't bore you with the details. But basically it says the initial computer stage eliminated people with prior exposure. And then finally, on-site, there were some additional eliminations. The questionnaire was made up of 6 separate validated scales. I'm going to go through them in more detail, so I'm just flashing them here, and I'll show you an overview of the scale, and then when I do the results, I'll actually give you a bit more meat so that the results are more meaningful to you. The questionnaires essentially polled spiritual, mental, and physical health parameters. There were 5 surveys, and I think the easiest is going to be to actually show it on a timeline. So we started off with the 211, and the period prior to actually starting the seminar, after submitting the registration, varied from 213 days to the actual day of the seminar. but by far the majority were within 2 weeks. And that's relevant because the outcomes following the seminar were profound. So by far the majority of individuals completed the first survey within 2 weeks of the seminar. Following the 5 days, the second survey was completed online, actually on site, literally just towards another room. Then after 1 month, after 3 months, and between 1 and 3 years later. So that's the span in which we followed them up. This is the 26 controls, and we tried to invite the same controls to resubmit, but some had died, and we only got 6 which didn't permit analysis. So that's one of the weaknesses. We would have loved to do a proper case control. We didn't bribe people to do it. They basically got the invitation online during registration, and we offered them a free copy of Henry Wright's book, A More Excellent Way. The teachers and the program director had no idea who the subjects were. All correspondence was done in the background, so there was no bias towards or in favor of the subjects on the study. And the research coordinator conducted the on-site interview, gave them the book if they were accepted, prompted each individual only twice to do a survey. In other words, you got 2 pings after you'd completed the program, and if you didn't complete the survey, we didn't call, we didn't solicit, we left it basically to that level of prompting. After the 4th survey, we called everybody and find out how they were, so we got a bit of qualitative information, and in December 2012, we realized that the results were, I don't want to say too good to be true, but we really felt that we needed that extra 5th point, and that's really what prompted the 5th survey 1 to 3 years later. Alright, so let me give you a little bit of detail on the scales. As I say, I have no background in the social sciences prior to my exposure to Harold Koenig's program, so don't feel intimidated if you don't have either. Let me give you the benefit of what these scales represent, because most of them are translated in multiple languages and in fact validated in many languages. So you might be able to replicate this exact same study if you would want to immediately with a validated scale. Now, Harold Koenig has studied extensively the associations of so-called extrinsic and intrinsic religiosity and health. In other words, whether you sit in church, whether you go to Bible study, that's extrinsic religiosity, versus whether you experience God, have an active faith life, and apply the principles of your faith in daily living, which is intrinsic religiosity. And it's important to differentiate the two, because pew warming, in other words, just sitting in church, does not produce health outcomes. It's the active faith life that produces the changes. Now, how this questionnaire or survey tool is used is in regression analysis. In other words, they associate extrinsic religiosity with outcomes in, for instance, cardiovascular disease. And the same with intrinsic religiosity. So that's the objective. It's got excellent retest reliability, and as I say, it makes that distinction. So that's the Durrell scale. The next one I mentioned briefly in the introduction is the issue of religious coping, of which negative religious coping is the one we're interested in. Now, Ken Pargament originally produced the full religious coping scale based on 3 populations. Survivors of the Oklahoma bombing, students with a social life crisis, and elderly inpatients with typically either critical illness or end-of-life situations. So that was the population from which this was derived. And they assessed the typical things that a faith or religious framework would offer an afflicted individual, such as meaning, control over what's happening, comfort, intimacy, and life transformation. 7 of those questions, which I'll detail just before I give you the results, poll negative religious coping. In other words, things that have been shown to be harmful to your health. And those were very reliable and associated with physical complaints, psychological distress, and of course, depressive illness. Now, in terms of the negative component of the scale, it assesses the meaning aspect of what faith does for you by determining whether you think God is punishing you, whether the devil is imposing the disease upon you and God is doing nothing about it, or that God can't do anything about it. In other words, there's a limitation to God's power. or that you are dissatisfied that God has abandoned you, the church has abandoned you, and those make up the 7 components. So those were the questions that people answered affirmatively who had poor health outcomes. So that's the second scale, the RCOPE, and specifically the negative RCOPE. Then depression. The Center for Epidemiology and Statistics depression scale is called the workhorse of depression measurement because you can use it in the general population, excellent test-retest reliability, and good sensitivity and specificity. So you'll detect depression, and what you detect is depression. The next scale is the Brief Illness Perception Questionnaire by Leventhal. This looks at what you think about in terms of your illness and what you feel in terms of your illness. And I'll show you some of the questions in a moment. Again, it's got good test-retest reliability, and it's been studied in asthma, diabetes, cardiac rehabilitation, colds, cancer, MS, back pain. It's been well validated in a number of disease states. Got 2 more to go. Perceived stress is an assessment of non-specific stress. So in other words, that you feel that you can't cope with life circumstances. Again, good reliability and validity. It has been associated specifically with abnormal physiological markers. In other words, the perceived stress scale has been associated with high cortisone, lowered immunity, delayed wound healing, elevated prostate-specific antigen. So this scale actually has a 50% predictive value for morbidity. So if that goes down, it really has a strong correlation with health issues and improvement. The last scale is probably or arguably the best validated scale on so-called state and trait anxiety. State anxiety is basically situational tension or stress. Trait anxiety means that you are a worried person. You are an anxious person. It's an assessment of long-term disposition. The trait anxiety has good test-retest because it's long-term. State anxiety obviously would vary, as indeed one would expect it would. That's just a screenshot of what the questionnaire might look like. All of the survey questions are Likert scale. In other words, never, sometimes, often, always. Those types of scales. Some are graded in 4, some go as high as 11. Here we go for the results. Let me first give you just an overview. This is our study sample. You can see that we've got a good distribution. Those were the cases males, cases females, controls males, controls females. We only had females in the final control, so we couldn't do the case control. But you can essentially see at almost every time point after immediately following the seminar, you had about a halving of individuals. And then eventually we invited both the people who had completed all 4, and in fact some of the dropouts here, we invited some of them to also complete the 5th survey so that we could catch as many 1 to 3 year outcomes as we could. The study didn't favour any particular gender or age. You can see it's well distributed from 18 all the way to 85. And most attendees were within 2 weeks of the For My Life program. So the results following the program were most likely due to the program itself. There wasn't a long time delay. This is just a quality assurance slide showing basically that we kept to the time-sensitive times. That should be somewhere between 5 and 7. That should be around 30. That should be around 60. So you can see that we kept very strictly, and I must congratulate Lavender on doing that. The delays that there were based on the person's response, not the submission of the invitation to complete the survey. Okay, so before I show you the individual results on those 6 dimensions, let me just again refresh your memory on what each of the scales represents. The first one is the issue of whether or not you have an externally active faith life and or an internally active faith life, and how that changed in response to the study. Now, a perfect score would be 6, so you can see that most of the people who came did attend church, and of course after sitting in church for a week you could hardly really record much of a change afterwards. But there was a significant increase, and at least people didn't attend church less after going through the faith faith-based seminar. So that's a good start. The non-organizational religious activity, in other words, whether these people did Bible study or did other private or non-organizational activities, also improved. Again, the second one is not relevant because it was still in association with the program. But again, people did tend to stay active, although there seemed to be a trend after 1 to 3 years of not being as active in non-organizational religion. But this is the one that I was most interested in, because this is intrinsic religiosity. In other words, this means you experience God, you apply God's word in your daily living, and you live from a faith-based perspective. And this improved statistically. You can see 15 is the perfect score. People were already spiritually oriented, but there was a significant increase. And most importantly, it persisted over 3 years. How about negative religious coping? I've actually got detailed slides on each one of the subsets. I don't have time to go into each of them, so I'm just going to summarize what was found collectively. What you're looking at is a box and whisker graph showing you within the box 50% of the population. That's the first survey, that's the fifth survey. So what you can see is that there was a lot of scattering in negative religious coping. A high score is better. And you can see that the population actually homogenized. In other words, they became similar after the training, and they improved, and the values remained improved. So negative religious coping was dealt with, and once it had changed, it did not revert. And I think that is a very important outcome to assess in any spiritually oriented program. Let's look at depression. Now, I'm not going to show the details. You're welcome to look it up. It's a well-published scale, but it would assess anything we would do in our practices. It assesses sadness, loss of interest, loss of appetite, sleep problems, thinking and concentration problems, guilt, tiredness, and agitation, and suicide ideation. So those are the typical things that one would poll. This scale is the other way around. In other words, that's survey 1, that's survey 5. And you can see that there's quite a scattergram again, so there's a wide distribution, but look how the population narrows. And in fact, if that isn't impressive enough, let me show you, those who are familiar with biostatistics, these are 95% confidence intervals. This is prior to the program. That is immediately after the program. That is a highly statistically significant change. And the change was sustained in depression. But what does that mean clinically? It's all very well to look at a graph. What did that mean in actual practice? This bar graph shows you a subgroup analysis of the different degrees of depression. Now, below 15 is low grade. If you score below 15, between 15 and 22 is moderate, and above 22 would be major. And based on that, this was essentially the allocation. Those were the number of major depressions, about 50%. Immediately following the seminar, it dropped to about 15%. And that ratio was sustained. And I would say that that vies with any drug that you would be able to assess on the market. In fact, it is superior to it because it didn't require follow-up. So I think this is a very exciting finding and something we should explore. How about the way people felt about their illness? Did it affect them? How long would it last? Could they control it? Was the treatment working? How bad were the symptoms? Etc., etc. Well, that also introduced a change. In other words, once people had a biblical perspective and understanding of disease, their responsibility in it, and restored their relationship with God, self, and others, there was a reframing of how they understood their disease. And remember, even a normal population would not score 0. This approximates a normal population. So again, a change, and a change that persisted. Again, the confidence intervals, highly statistically significant. 2 more to go. Perceived stress. That's basically whether you can cope with life. You're upset, you're out of control, things are out of control, you're unhappy about it, etc. This is how perceived stress changed. Normal is around 12. In other words, these people were from pathological to normal. That's the median value after 5 days. And that persisted. And this has a 50% predictive value of health outcomes. In other words, cortisone changes, immune markers change, healing changes, prostate-specific antigen, very specific biological markers are associated with this change. So that was really neat. The last scale, made up of 2 subsets, is the State Trait Anxiety Index. And here, state looks at short-term, past month, and trait, are you an anxious person? So as you might expect, state anxiety would poll things like I feel calm, I feel tense, I feel at ease, I feel indecisive. They're essentially intermediate term assessments. And you can see again, immediately after the seminar, dramatic change, and the change was sustained. And they're the confidence intervals again. And in fact, remember, you can't score 0. Between 80 and 20 is the range. And this is actually better than the average population of the United States, from where most of the people came from. So the pathological population normalized after the seminar. Finally, and this is the one that I'm perhaps the most excited about, trait anxiety. In other words, it has become part of who you are. You are now dispositionally anxious. You are an anxious person. You can't help yourself. And in this group, trait anxiety initially dropped, and this is a long-term measure, remember. So even this was surprising, but more impressively, it changed statistically and long-term. People were changed. People's personality changed. And that is exciting. To wrap up the discussion, we would be able to say that this particular 5-day systematic approach produced significant and enduring changes on intrinsic religiosity. In other words, people's relationship with God and their active faith life, their perspective on where God was in relation to the affliction, depression, perception of illness, perceived stress, state anxiety, and trait anxiety. A limitation was that we didn't have the control group we had hoped for. That's certainly something we need to add. Clearly, this polled largely a United States population. We cannot necessarily extrapolate to other nations, although anecdotally, the other being health ministries throughout the world have reported similar outcomes, but that is clearly a limitation of the study. There were immediate changes following the seminar, and remember that most people completed the first survey within 2 weeks of attending. So it's very unlikely, given the duration of the long-term follow-up, that there was any other agent of change. In conclusion, this is evidence that the active application of God's Word, God's principles, prayer, ministry, in relation to a health orientation focused on sanctification and relational restoration produces long-term spiritual, mental and physical health parameter improvement when done deliberately and in a fairly short period of time. We're still going to continue with factor analysis. The manuscript is being prepared for the International Journal of Medicine and Psychiatry, and I would strongly encourage you to actually think about doing something like this in your communities and communities of faith. I'd love to help you. It's certainly a challenge, but it's not that hard to do. And hopefully my teething problems would save you yours. I hope to encourage you with this, and thank you for your attention.